Say something.
Hey.
How's it going?
Pretty good. So we're here. This is the first episode of Wisdom for Life, a new show that's devoted to talking about philosophy and how it can be made practical.
Yeah. So what we are talking about here a lot is going to be practical philosophy and how that differs from the kind of idea of what is academic philosophy.
Exactly. So we've got a lot of cool stuff lined up for this hour, and we'll give you a little rundown of that. But first, I think we'll introduce ourselves. So let me introduce my co-host, Dan Hayes. He can tell you a little bit about himself.
So I'm the co-organizer of the Milwaukee Stoic Fellowship, and I also run a weekly Stoic meetup at the Humboldt Collectivo Sunday mornings.
Yeah, Dan is kind of underselling himself a bit. He does a lot of organizing when it comes to practical philosophy stuff here in the Milwaukee area.
I do what I can, and the illustrious Professor Greg Sadler.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So I'm somebody who started out in academia doing philosophy in, the traditional academic way, teaching classes. And then I started realizing how useful it could be in a lot of different contexts. And now, we have a lot of cool stuff going on in here in Milwaukee. We have the Stoic Fellowship that Dan and I are both leading, I guess you'd say, co-organizers.
Yes.
And there's other things going on as well. There's a group called Sophia Milwaukee, which is devoted to public philosophy, and there's events around the year. So we'll probably talk about some of those on the show. We should probably talk a little bit about how we got the idea for doing the show as well.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us that story, Greg?
Well, we'd been kicking the idea around for quite a while, right? We thought maybe a podcast or something along those lines, and then
we got the opportunity here.
Yeah, and Riverwest Radio is community radio, so it's perfectly suited to this sort of endeavor because we can offer a rather unique voice that probably I don't think there's anything like this in the Midwest right now. I
don't know. It's all that the local stations that were popping up in the mid 2000s, and it really gives a voice for the community. But we came here and we had a really great Christmas special.
That's right.
Or a holiday special. Talking about why it's good to give.
Yeah, and generosity as a virtue, and when you want to give and when you don't want to give, and all those sorts of things. And we looked at it from a philosophical perspective, mostly informed by Stoicism, which is something that Dan and I have in common, but bringing in some other perspectives as well. And we liked being on the radio so much that we decided to make it a regular thing. So we're going to be here every other Friday. Go ahead.
From 5 to 6 p.m., talking for an hour.
Yeah, and we'll have different topics. This first episode, we thought we would introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about what the show is going to be about in general terms. And so we have some things already lined up. But one of the things I do want to point out is each show, at least so far as we've got it in mind right now, will probably close out the show by talking about an actionable philosophical practice that you could put into practice right after finishing the show or listening to the show, and it'll be drawn from ancient or medieval or modern philosophy, and we'll put it into terms that are easy to understand. And we'll also be looking at
questions from the community.
Exactly, yeah. Real life issues that can be illuminated by philosophy. Not totally solved, but at least we can get some guidelines on how to deal with them.
I mean, we've got thousands of years of history and people deep thinking about these ideas, and the human condition hasn't changed all that much on a really macro level.
That's right. Yeah, it's surprising. It's just a little bit of experiential stuff. I've been teaching philosophy classes for about 20 years now, and one of the cool experiences that I have is about students having a certain kind of experience themselves, which is let's take Plato, right? They read Plato, and I have them read Plato's Republic, and they groan a bit. Oh, I got to read this old text. And then they read what's going on, say, in Book 4, where Plato's talking about these 3 parts of the soul and theological stuff, and then they read it, and they're like, oh, wait a second, this is psychology. And man, this actually, it may not be exactly the right way to look at it, but this illuminates a lot of stuff for me. This helps me make sense of things, and we see those aha moments, and then there's more that can come out of it. You say, well, if you like that, you could read this as well. It's really gratifying.
Mm-hmm. So the question is, which horse are you?
Oh, that's the Phaedrus. Yeah. Well, I've always, I'm going to use a term here, and we're always going to try to define terms as best as we can, so that you don't have to have a background in philosophy in order to understand this. But I'm going to say I'm a thumatic kind of person, meaning that in Plato's terms, I'm driven by this middle part of the soul, which is the part with which we experience courage, but also anger, and respond to potential threats or insults or things like that. So that has been my background. That's why I got into researching anger management using ancient philosophy. So I'll kind of cop to that right off the bat. I am not, as a person, I am not really the rational charioteer in the model that Plato uses in the Phaedrus. I'm more the good horse. At least I'm not the bad horse.
Hey.
What about you, Dan? Which are you?
I definitely used to be the a little bit more of the bad horse, and
driven by your appetites and
passion more than anything.
Okay,
and that chaos and life happens, and you learn new things, and you realize that there are better ways about going about your life, and so that is definitely something I've.
Well, that's a nice segue right there into talking a little bit more about philosophy. So here, for our listeners to get a sense of how you got into it. I mean, they know that I got into it through academic philosophy. Mm-hmm. What drew you into studying philosophy? And in particular, what drew you into Stoicism?
Okay, so I was at university, University of Wisconsin, and I was doing an all-nighter working on a bioinformatics project. And about 3 a.m., I just needed to not look at my code anymore, and I needed to look at something else to just clear my mind and not be thinking about that. And had been following a podcast that brought up Stoicism. I thought that was kind of sounded interesting. I brought up this page that was referenced in this podcast, and I'm reading just the really basics of Stoicism. And I'm like, oh yes, that makes sense, and that makes sense, and that's exactly how I used to react to things, and I really should react to them in just a little bit better way. And this seems to be a really interesting path forward. Maybe this will work out. And so that was my aha moment.
That's good. Interestingly, when I first encountered Stoicism, I didn't have quite the same reaction. And again, I was in an academic context, and I was probably, I don't know if I was younger. I was in my early 20s, and I read Epictetus's Enchiridion and Marcus's Meditations. And I was very drawn to the, like, you know, resiliency and toughness and don't let things get to you. But all the notion of, like, well, you know, you got to be just and wise. I wasn't that much into that stuff. Or temperance. I was definitely not into temperance when I was in college.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. But, you know, found some guys out in California while I was living out there that were also meeting as regular Stoics, or at least.
Yeah, it seems like they had a pretty well organized group, right?
Yeah, well, there are like 3 Stoic groups in the San Francisco Bay Area itself, but I was with the Fremont Stoics.
You know, actually, before we jump into the topic that we were going to schedule to do at this point, what do you think? What do you think the value of having like meetups or local groups where you can actually talk about philosophy with other people that are not necessarily all that learned in it, but are interested in it? What value did that provide you with?
The very least, you know, community. We're all looking for that group of people that kind of understands you, and we're all going through different paths in life. And if you're trying to use, you know, philosophy as a way of life, which we'll get to in just a moment, that it's really useful to have other people that are also trying to do this project and to kind of compare notes.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. Knowing that you're not the only person in the room who's into something, there's something about that's particularly compelling, you know, supportive, helpful to people.
We are really, you know, fundamentally social creatures.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So,
well, let's talk about how philosophy is becoming kind of a bigger thing. Oh, non-academically. Unfortunately, a lot of philosophy departments, including my alma maters, are really having a rough time. You know, the place where I went to undergraduate no longer has a philosophy degree, hasn't had it for a long time. The place where I did my graduate studies, their department has shrunk terribly because it's been, you know, underfunded in Illinois for so long. So, you know, academic philosophy, having a rough time, right? But
that's not really the point of this program.
Well, right. So philosophy is doing pretty good outside of the academy. I mean, we could say, well, that's because of the internet and the fact that people can now connect with each other and find resources all over the world. And I think that's part of it. But what else do you think is driving that? Well,
I feel like it comes down to we have turned philosophy into this kind of stuffy, you know, ivory tower idea. At least that's what the common idea of what we call philosophy nowadays is. And we moved away from more the ancient understanding of philosophy, which is, you know, having a specific idea of the world and how you should act within it, and trying daily to, you know, act your values. And
yeah, that's, you know, this is a bit of a side note, but there have been quite a few scandals within the ethics community, the academic ethics community, where people who are doing academic philosophy and specializing in ethics, you find out that they do these terrible things. You know? And then some people, you know, people reasonably said, well, what good is ethics if it's not actually making the people, not just the students who are studying it, but the people who are actually teaching it, if it's not going to make them better people? And I think a lot of that has to do with the walking the walk, you know, daily practice. There's a lot of people who conceive of philosophy as kind of this, like you said, you know, it's an elite activity. It's for people who are going to put in their time, and then they go on and do whatever they're going to do. It's not really part of their life.
Yeah, and so when we actually make it part of our lives, and you've set now, like, oh, well, you know, we should have a little bit of wisdom and courage and justice in our life, and like, how do you actually make that? That seems like a really kind of pie in the sky idea, and how do we bring that back down to earth?
Yeah, you know, and it's interesting. Well, let's take Stoicism as an example. So you mentioned these things that we call the cardinal virtues of wisdom, temperance, justice and courage, and there's other names for them that we could use, like moderation for temperance, which is kind of an old-fashioned name. A lot of people like to substitute an old-fashioned name, fortitude, for courage, but it's really all the same thing. And so you say to people, okay, so you should aim for these virtues. This is a good thing for you. It'll make you have a better life. And then they say, yeah, but what about kindness? And this is something that we talked about previously. If you read the Stoic texts, you find out that, well, kindness was actually part of justice. But if you're just going by sort of a surface thumbnail kind of read, then you'd say, well, I don't know if this is really for me. It seems like it doesn't cover all the things that we want it to like help us out with.
How dare you be not benevolent? How is that not something that's part of your core?
Well,
but it is.
If it were true, that would be a legitimate beef with the Stoics, right? And so, more reading, more study of the particular philosophical text often reveals all sorts of cool features of the philosophy to us that then help people to integrate these things into their life. I kind of agree with you that philosophy recently got turned in, and we'll use the old catchphrase, an ivory tower sort of thing, right? Uh-huh. And I think that for a long time, for maybe like the 70s and 80s, it was quite popular in philosophy departments to pride themselves on how inaccessible they were to everybody else.
Oh, is it like Heidegger?
Yeah, well, I'm not thinking about Heidegger so much, but because he certainly would fit in there. He's earlier, but you had people interpreting him. But I'm thinking about more the typical American and British philosophers who would, probably be talking more about how to interpret Wittgenstein or Russell or Ayer, or people like that, or then later on people who are more contemporary with them, like Ryle. And they talked about philosophy as if it's something that shouldn't have to justify itself, right? And that's always a bad sign when you're doing that, because if you can't explain what you're doing and why you're doing it to other people, if you can't provide a rational account, then why should they pay for you to do it, right? And so when there's plenty of money flowing into universities, well, then you could afford to be elitist. But as soon as there's budget crises, that means that philosophy would be on the chopping block, right? So I think that we're going to see less and less of that sort of thing, and more of what we're doing here, which is trying to make philosophy practical and public and popular.
And you can see in the public stage, a practical philosophy or a public philosophy has been growing. There's Stoic groups exploding all over the United States, as well as in Europe and in Canada, as well as there are the new Epicureans and several other groups. You're talking about the Randians and
you could look at all sorts of movements. So I would say that among the Hellenistic philosophies, Stoicism, in the sense of modern Stoicism, very broadly speaking, trying to have contemporary interpretations of it, has been the most successful. There's, like you said, there's groups popping up almost monthly now across the world, and there's an annual Stoicon, and one way that you can tell that a movement is really doing well is when there's factions within it who can be opposed to each other and say, you've got the wrong interpretation. So there's the traditional Stoics who say that the modern Stoics have got it all wrong, but the traditional Stoics are contemporary people as well. They just, they're a little bit more committed to the theology. And then you're right, the Epicureans, actually a new book came out just this last year, How to Be an Epicurean, by Catherine Wilson, but there was another really good book by Hiram Crespo, who's down in Chicago, Cultivating the Epicurean Garden a couple years back, and they have groups as well, much smaller. And then there's Facebook groups associated with these. I think that any
maybe if they had bigger gardens.
Well, the goal is to ensconce yourself in this garden so nothing can get to you. So it can't be too big, right? Yeah. And if you have to do a lot of work to cultivate it, I don't know that that's in line with what they want to do. Right? They don't value work for its own sake. So
I hear that gardening is enjoyable from some time to time.
That's true. Yeah. And yeah, there's a lot of other going concerns, let's say, different communities that offer philosophy as something that you would commit yourself to and practice. It's not as if it's not rigorous, because there's texts, there's thinkers, there's ideas that have to be studied and worked upon and sometimes reinterpreted, to deal with new problems. But it's vital. And that sense of community that we were talking about at the beginning is very important as well.
So this kind of leads us to the idea of philosophy as a way of life, and what does it actually mean? And so, we're using the term or the title of the book by the French philosopher Pierre Hadot, and his deep reading of what the ancient philosophers were actually doing. And so this is actually kind of one of the main places where modern philosophy kind of relearned what it meant to be a philosopher in the ancient sense, to actually be that person that is trying to live a way of life. Yeah,
and when we say modern in this case, we really mean very late moderns, like 19th and 20th century, because Hadot points out that he's looking at the ancients primarily, but he points out that the existentialists are also very committed to philosophy as a way of life. He points out a number of other movements along the way. And I think that we could even take somebody who's kind of, in many people's eyes, a boogeyman of philosophy as a way of life. They think it's very abstract and very disconnected from life. Rene Descartes, right? Mm-hmm. To be accused of being a Cartesian is a very bad thing, not only in philosophical circles, but in sort of academic circles generally, right? But Descartes himself, if you read his writings, especially if you read his letters and then you read like the introductions to his works, he saw what he was doing as a philosophical project that would, transform the way people lived. It was very practically oriented. There's a lot of theory involved, mm-hmm. and it's pretty cool stuff to teach and to talk about. But he thought that he was going to transform the world and make it better by the way that he was proposing doing philosophy, with a fresh start, and
ground up rebuild.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think that this notion of philosophy as something that would be lived, it's not something foreign to most of the history of philosophy, or rather, let's say, most of philosophy's history, because we can make a distinction there. History of philosophy is kind of a specialty where you're like trying to figure out, well, why did Descartes actually say this thing? Was he influenced by this guy at this time? And that can be kind of, it's fun stuff, but it doesn't really reach ordinary people, I think. But if you bring up, say, like Descartes' rules of method in his discourse, and you set them out, and then this is what I do with undergraduates when I'm teaching it. I say, now, how would this actually work in your discipline? You're going into nursing. How would you approach it as a Cartesian? And the light bulb comes on. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a sign that there is something connecting there. This could be lived as a way of life. David Hume saw philosophy that way. We teach these people as if they're engaging in philosophy in the 20th century in an academic sense. But really what they were trying to do is think about philosophy in a much broader sense in which it could transform our lives and help us, make progress towards whatever we are doing and get ourselves out of some silly errors. And so, Hadot, as you mentioned, focuses a lot on ancient philosophy, and we probably will too. But there's a lot of other examples throughout the history. Yeah.
So when we are talking about this, a lot of it is, choosing certain values in which are important, and like, is there a hierarchy of these values, and depending on the school or your own maybe eclectic version of these things, that you have to make some sort of decisions about what you're going to follow, and to make a commitment to actually follow through on these day in and day out.
Yeah, I like that you brought up a hierarchy of values. We can talk about prioritization, right?
Right.
A term that we usually use in contemporary stuff, but we don't think of it in terms of philosophy. as helping us to prioritize better. But you're right. The ancients, they say, well, think about these really fundamental things that people desire. Some people really do just want to have a good time. Mm-hmm. So that, pleasure or avoidance of pain and trouble and having security. Other people want to make $1 million. Mm-hmm. And, they think that if you just can make a lot of money or have income streams coming in or, whatever it happens to be richer than the neighbor next door, that's having made it. That's happiness. Others said friendship. Relationships, having those, harmonious, that could be good. And there's lots of other things. And how in ancient times, they recognized that there's only so many different ways you can configure these. There's like a combinatorics, right? If we think about it in mathematical terms, you only got so many options. And you got to think about, well, which one are you going to put ahead of which, or are you just going to kind of like throw them all in the air and let them land wherever they happen to land? And which school you pick, it determines at least the answer at how you ought to prioritize. And then you're stuck with the fact that you know what the blueprint is, and you look at yourself and you put that blueprint as sort of like superimposed on yourself, and you're like, oh, this is a mess.
Yeah.
This doesn't meet the blueprint at all. How would I do this? How would I actually make any progress towards, say, if I want to say that being a good person, moral virtue, right? Virtue of character, if that's really what's good, and I look at myself, I could do this today and say, well, I'm okay on this front, but not on that. There's a lot of work to be done. Yeah. How do you do the work? And so that's
kind of the main point of this whole radio show is
how to do the work.
How to do the work.
Yeah. And we're not giving you answers that we're like coming up with just on the spot. Hopefully, they're going to be informed to some degree by philosophy, and so we don't actually have to do that much heavy lifting.
Yeah. Thankfully, there's a lot of guys who sat around and try to figure out the human condition.
And women, too. Mary Wollstonecraft, great example. Yeah. So,
to try to figure out the inner workings of what makes a good life. And once we have an idea of what makes a good life, then they spent a lot more time trying to figure out the best ways of getting there. And so we are here to try to offer to you some of their wisdom passed down.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. So philosophy as a way of life is experiential. It does involve some reading and some study, but it involves putting things into practice and then seeing what the results are. And sometimes, you can know something intellectually. You can know, okay, I should do this thing, and here's how it's supposed to work. But until you actually try it out and usually fail at it a couple times and then figure out what you did wrong and then get it to work, you don't really know it, right?
And the first step at being sort of good at something is sucking at something. So we all start off at the bottom. We all work
That's
up.
True, yeah.
But the idea is to have a little bit of fortitude or courage to try it.
To persevere.
Yeah. And see if it actually works.
Yeah, that's actually another good thing to point out. And I'm sure we'll talk about this plenty in other episodes. A lot of people want instant results. Mm-hmm. And I'll bring up another term that's been floating around a lot that is kind of connected to philosophy as a way of life, but could actually block the road to it. Mm-hmm. And that's the notion of life hack.
Right.
So people, there's all sorts of articles out there, mostly having to do with Stoicism, but I think you could find them on others, like how to hack your life and, transform it by using Marcus Aurelius, reading him for 10 minutes a day. Well, you're probably going to have to read him more than 10 minutes a day, and you're going to have to like do stuff, and it should be systematically connected with things, and you'll have to like do some taking stock each day and see whether you're making any progress or not. But this life hack mentality, it's the promise seems to be like, well, it's almost like taking a pill, right, or flipping a switch.
Get that instant gratification.
Yeah. That's right. It doesn't just fix things; it makes you feel better, right?
But sometimes feeling better isn't the path to actually making your life better.
Yeah, well, especially if you've screwed it up.
Yeah, right? Unless you're the Epicureans, and then.
Well, even they are willing to say, there's some cases where you really do have to, as we say, rip off the Band-Aid and take the pain so that you can improve. For example, people think about Epicureans, they hear this term and they're like, oh, that means partying all the time. And the ancient Epicureans didn't do that, right? Because what happens when you party all the time? Well, you get hungover, or you can't figure out where you left your car, or, you wake up next to somebody and you're not sure who they are. And these are not things that make your life better, right?
Especially once you're after 30.
Yeah, that's very true. The body has much less tolerance for those sort of shenanigans.
Right.
But go ahead.
Oh, it's deferred pain. You spend a night drinking and the next day dealing with that.
Yeah.
It's a debt that is gets more and more larger and larger. Your payback every year.
And there are some exceptions. People whose bodily constitution is stronger than the average. Think about Lemmy from Motorhead, who would reputedly drink like a fifth of whiskey a day, and he smoked all sorts of cigarettes, and he'd get up, no problem, he'd get up on stage and do his thing. And then when he found out that he was sick, I think he cut back from a certain amount of liquor to a smaller amount of liquor. I mean, that would kill me to do that sort of thing. I think even in my 20s, that would have killed me to do that.
Well, it sounds like he was definitely a functioning alcoholic.
Yeah. Yeah. And a very high performer, too.
Oh, sure. You can be a performer and a functioning alcoholic. Doesn't mean it's a particularly good state to be in.
As a matter of fact, in some respects, being able to get away with something like that is actually a disadvantage. Because you come to rely on it. I'll give you an example from my own life. So when I was in my teens and 20s, I was eating a lot, like probably anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 calories a day, but I was also exercising an awful lot, sometimes 3-4 hours a day. And because that was very important to me at the time, very invested in being strong and body image, and it felt good to do. And then I made the mistake as I moved into my 30s of not tempering the amount that I was eating, the enjoyment that I was taking in food, right? And I wasn't exercising as much. And, it's almost like mathematics, right? So many calories going in, so many calories going out. If you don't expend them, they're going to, accumulate, and they accumulate in fat. So, there's all sorts of ways that people do that, where they find something that's functional for them at one point in their life, and it may be very pleasurable, and then they don't...
Goes on autopilot. You don't re-examine the thing. And one of the big things that we find, and it's a good spiritual practice, or... which is the next topic here, is the idea of taking assessment every day, or maybe weekly or monthly assessments to see what you are doing and make sure that they are not they are actually appropriate for what you need at the moment.
Honest assessments.
Oh yes,
because it doesn't do any good if you kind of hedge a little bit on what's going on in your life. You have to be looking at it. It might actually be helpful to have somebody else involved in the assessment project at certain points to give you some guidance and say, no, you lose your temper a lot more often than you think you do.
Yes, and that's another reason why we should have a community working through these things. We are so good at fooling ourselves into thinking that we are better than we might think.
Yeah, or we're less worse. Less bad? Less bad.
Less bad.
Yeah.
So spiritual practices, I believe, is coined also by Hadot.
Yeah.
Which he was going through specifically Marcus Aurelius in really deep fashion. He was trying to figure out what this particular work was, and he finally dawned upon him that this was him writing to himself every day or every morning about the things that he is either trying to do that day, or a reflection on the things that he had done that day, and all the things that he was preparing to do that day were also other spiritual practices. So,
yeah, and we should mention, so Marcus Aurelius' Meditations is a work that's not very systematic.
No.
And so, why would Hadot have to figure out what's going on? Because the work is, frankly speaking, kind of a mess when you read it, right?
Very. It's all over the place.
So it makes good sense that he'd zero in on that. And Hadot uses this word spiritual. So he's writing in French, and in French, the term spirit, esprit, means what we usually think of as spirit, but it also means mind. So you could think of these as mental practices as well, if you want to use that term. They are things that are supposed to be transforming the person, helping them understand who they are, helping them develop towards their good, and there's a whole variety of them. Right. So
from all the different schools, if you're trying to do one thing, you've set certain values up because you're following one school, then there's a set of practices for that.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. You don't have to it's not as if you have to pick a school and then you can only read their stuff and think about that. I mean, you can steal stuff from other schools. Seneca is a prime example of somebody who not only does that, but also justifies his doing that, right? Because he takes it from the school that's most directly opposed to the Stoics, the Epicureans. But the justification is, they got something good over there. Let's make it our own. And so,
I believe he was talking about ideas want to be spread.
Yeah. They don't. They're sort of a common wealth of humankind, right?
Right.
Yeah.
You should not reserve yourself only to one school or one teacher or one thought.
Yeah. And so spiritual practices. What are they? They are things that we do, and usually they can be framed in terms of a couple sentences to a paragraph. Do these things in this way. We're actually going to explore one of them towards the end of the show that we call negative visualization, just to give you an idea about how these things work. And you do them sometimes daily, sometimes less frequently, sometimes many times a day. And you can get better at them. You can do them, more effectively. And over time, they produce transformations in you. And the transformations can be cognitive in what we think or what we understand. They can be affective, that is in how we feel things or what we desire. And they can also help us to develop new habits and to break old habits that are getting in our way. And I think another dimension that often gets left out, they change our relationships or offer new possibilities for relationships for us.
Both with ourselves and others.
Exactly, yeah.
And so one that, many people might be aware of is, within the Buddhist tradition, Vipassana or mindfulness meditation is a very strong, spiritual practice. It's a looking into the inner workings of your mind and trying to be more aware of that as well as your feeling within the world.
Yeah. And now let's talk about that a little bit. So it's a good thing to do at various points, right? You encounter something that's annoying or something, you could stop and think, well, what's actually going on here with me? But it's also something that people would deliberately do on a schedule, right?
Right. So you can either fall into it in an experience where it might be useful for a immediate reassessing of the situation that you're in, or sit down and do your 10 or hour long meditation, and the more you do
it's
it,
a lot of meditation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there you're talking about what only a few monks can do. Right? But I mean, the rest of us can do all sorts of shorter ones. We can break it up and still derive the benefits from it. And by doing it regularly, you're setting yourself up to be able to do it spontaneously when you're in a situation, right?
Right. Allow you to kind of drop into that headspace.
Yeah. There's another thing that the Stoics over and over again say, have X, whatever X happens to be, ready at hand. And they usually mean some saying, but it's actually not just a saying, it's also a practice. So like when Epictetus says, have ready at hand these different things, so when you encounter a troubling situation, you can, for example, say to something that's appearing to you to be the way it is, let me have a little bit of a pause here, let's see whether you're actually representing things as they are. Having that verbal phrase is helpful, right? It's not just something that you feel or do, it's something that you can explain to another person or explain to yourself.
Yeah, I guess people suffer more in thought than in reality.
Yeah.
At-hand phrase.
Yeah, although that's better to have at hand for yourself than to console somebody who's currently suffering.
Right.
They don't usually want to hear that.
So this is
good segue, right?
Right. So we have a question that has been submitted for the show today.
And actually I'm drawing this from one of the Facebook groups, which talks about Stoicism, where people bring up common life problems. And it runs like this. I've been studying Stoicism for about a year now, and I've been able to make some positive changes in my thinking. I wonder where the line is between ignoring something and allowing yourself to be a doormat. And there's a little bit more to it, but I think that's a good launching point. There's a lot of people who get involved in Stoicism, and they do so because they're drawn to it, because it seems to promise a resilience in the face of problems. But then there's this notion that it means just accepting anything that happens to you. And, well, what if people are jerks to you? What do you do?
And so this seems to be a common misconception of the full breadth of the philosophy. And so it's two major pieces. You have kind of this idea of the dichotomy of control, that the things that are under your control are the things that actually matter in life, and things that are outside other people's actions aren't things that have any effect on what your virtue is or what your how you should be experiencing the world. You shouldn't be upset with how other people act around you. And so they get into this kind of rut of thinking that this is the only way of looking at things, when in fact there's another big portion of Stoicism with this discipline of action, that it's not that you should be passive and not act at that particular moment, because it shouldn't affect your how you feel, but that it is the ability for you then to act in the proper way without being disturbed by how other people are acting.
Yeah, and we should talk a little bit about the dichotomy of control. I mean, we'll probably do a whole show on it later on down the line.
Absolutely.
So this is like Dan was saying, an absolutely central Stoic idea. It gets formulated explicitly by Epictetus, who's a late Stoic, but it seems to have played a big role prior to that. And the idea is that there's some things that are in our control or in our power or literally are up to us, and then there's other things that aren't. And they draw the line at a place where a lot of us maybe wouldn't, saying that our bodies aren't in our control, our money, our reputation, other people's actions, how other people think about us, none of those things are actually in our control. They don't mean that, of course, that you have no possible way of, influencing these, but it's, whatever you do could go astray. So if I want Dan to think I'm a swell guy, and he doesn't think so, I can do all sorts of nice things, buy him chocolates, take him out for drinks or something like that, give him a glowing review on Facebook, whatever it is.
I'm sorry, I'm just, I'm impervious to your charms over there.
Yeah, exactly. Talk him up, and he could say, well, I don't like this guy, there's nothing you can actually do about it. And then what is in our control? Our thoughts, our desires, our choices, all of the things that we think of as core to us, the kind of people that we want to be. And then that does seem to lay people, I think, feel like that lays them in for being insulted or humiliated or treated wrong. And then they're, a Stoic who I think doesn't quite get it would use some of the lines where they say, well, you think you're insulted? No, that's just your thought. You're not really being insulted. It's only, the viewpoint that you have on it. And that's kind of true, but also kind of not true. If I decide, so I'm sitting across from Dan right now, if I decide I want to say nasty things to him, I'm actually saying nasty things. Now, whether he lets that affect him or not, that's up to him, right? But it doesn't change the fact that I'm being a jerk by saying these things, objectively speaking, right?
And I can tell you're being a jerk, and you really shouldn't do that without actually feeling angry that he was saying those things to me.
Yeah, so let's talk about what seems to be the kind of the common issue in this question. It's about setting boundaries, right? So can you set boundaries reasonably without allowing yourself to get upset when those boundaries are crossed, or when the person makes fun of you for setting the boundaries, or whatever else we want to say about that? And the answer is yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But you have to be able to know where your boundaries are.
Oh, that's a good point. So this is where the Stoic conception of justice would come in, right? There's some things that we probably, even though we could not allow them to get to us, we probably shouldn't allow people to do them to us. Being a Stoic doesn't mean that you have to endure abuse forever and ever and ever to show everybody what a Stoic you are. I mean, if you were trying to evangelize for Stoicism, I guess that could be a good thing. But
that's the straw man argument for what it is.
Yeah. Now, why? Tell people what a straw man is.
A straw man is when you make you take someone else's position and you make the worst possible case for it, and so you're making a straw fake representation of what that argument is, and then you say, oh, look at this bad argument. I can easily knock that down without actually dealing with the substance of the idea that the other person is actually holding.
So how is this straw manning?
This is kind of like your Vulcan, your poor. A Vulcan is like a really bad understanding of Stoicism. It's like he's totally unemotional, and he lets absolutely nothing interact with him, and he's purely logical. Yeah. And
except for that one period, we're talking, of course, about in the Star Trek universe, where their hormones go haywire, and then they turn into just mindless brutes, right?
Yeah. Well,
I mean, actually, so this is actually a great launching point. The goal of any philosophy of life that's worth doing is not to cut off or repress things about ourselves that we think aren't particularly good. There may be some things where we want to say, oh, I don't want to do that anymore, but it's to integrate ourselves better. So rationality that's not integrated with emotions, neither one is really doing a very good job then, right?
Right. And so if we look at the opposite version of this would be a still manning, and you're looking at to try to make the best argument for it. And so whenever you are looking at a philosophical school or an idea that is beneficial for all, to try to present the idea or argument in the best way possible. And I feel like we will do that whenever we can.
Yeah, that's a commitment we can make, which we'll probably fail at, but but that's why we got two of us. We can catch it when we mess up that way, right?
Right.
But going back to the question, so being able to set boundaries, and then being able, if you think about what it takes to enforce boundaries, anytime that with some people, anytime you put up a boundary, that's like a invitation to them to try to cross it, right? And so if you're going to set a boundary, you do have to be prepared to say, there'll be some consequences or sanctions if you don't do this. I won't talk with you anymore. Or if you're stuck living with somebody, I suppose you say, well, listen, I'm just going to go in another room and I'm not going to engage with you if you're acting this way. And you could do that in a variety of different ways. You could do it in kind of a petulant way, like, I'm not going to do anything with you now, Or you can just be very firm and just stick to it and say, listen, I want to be treated in a certain way. This is a value to me. if you care about me, you're going to respect that. And then probably the first time the person will come up with some nonsense excuse. Oh, well, I get to do this because blah, 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 blah. But maybe if you keep doing it enough, and again, this sounds like it's putting too much pressure on the, the person who's being negatively affected to do the work. But that is what they have to do.
It's kind of life. Is you're not going to be presented with people that are going to be
perfect people. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. And it's a valuable skill to be able to transfer from situation to situation. So, first you do it maybe in a personal relationship. Well, then you can also do it at work, or you can do it with the person, I don't know, on the bus who won't, take their stuff off their seat and let you sit down. And you can do it and it's a very valuable thing to be able to bring into one's life.
And this is a perfect transition to our spiritual practice today, which is negative visualization.
Which sounds, rather negative.
Yes, but it's the trade-off, the better that we can. It's the opposite of like positive thinking, and positive thinking is like everything's going to work out.
Everything is fine, like that meme with the dog and the
sitting on the chair. House. Yeah,
exactly. Or this is fine. I think is what the dog is saying, right?
Yes.
Negative visualization. It's not to be morbid. It's not to dwell on painful or troubling or whatever negative modality we want to think about things for their own sake. It's to do it in order to have a better life. So I'll let Dan, I see him queuing up a passage right here from Marcus Aurelius. I'll let him bring up one of the classic forms of it.
Yeah, so this is from Book 2, Section 1 of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I've seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but of the same mind and possessing a share of the divine. And so none of them can hurt me, no one can implicate me in ugliness, nor can I feel angry at my relative or hate him. We are both born to work together, like feet and hands and eyes, and the two rows of teeth, upper and lower. To obstruct each other is unnatural. To feel anger at someone, to turn your back on him, these are obstructions.
Yeah, so this goes beyond just negative visualization. The first part is negative visualization, and then he brings in these reminders about how he can deal with the people. And somebody might say, oh, Marcus, man, he was a jerk. Look at how badly he talked about everybody. Well, no, he's being very realistic. He was an emperor, so think of him as like a CEO of a vast thing like Apple. Unless you just surround yourself with yes people who you're surrounding yourself with people who are lying to you, so you may as well say I'm going to encounter liars. You're going to have people like doing all sorts of crazy stuff that they shouldn't be doing, and they're not doing it because they just only made innocent mistakes. Some of them are actually bad people, So,
thinking about like every day, is it better to think in the morning, like, I'm going to get to work and everything's going to go perfectly well, or, and then you get in and someone cuts you off in traffic, and then you're like, I was expecting everything to be perfect, but now the reality is that didn't happen, versus it's like, what is it thinking, I'm going to get into an accident because there are stupid drivers around everywhere. And then you get to work and no one hit you. And so you're like, that was a lot better than what I had expected in the first place. My outcome is better than what I expected.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily have to be quite so dramatic. It could be, I'm going to get stuck in traffic, and people are going to honk at me from behind, and there's nothing I can do about it, and that bothers me. And then you can start thinking about, why? There's things you can do in negative visualization. So one is you can think about this thing that I'm visualizing. Why do I see it as so bad? And if you examine it kind of slowly and carefully, you can see, maybe actually it isn't that bad. I'm just typically reacting as if it's the end of the world. Like think about public speaking, right? Great fear of a lot of people. So you have to give a talk, a presentation at work, and you're like, oh, this is going to be terrible. I'm going to start sweating, and then people are going to see it, and I'm not going to pronounce the words right, and people are going to laugh at me. You can run all these sort of things through your mind, and yeah, some of them might actually happen, but is it going to be the end of the world if they do? I mean, how many other people have you seen present where they didn't say everything perfectly, and then people at the end were like, oh, good presentation. It wasn't perfect, but it doesn't have to be perfect, right?
And then another good benefit of this is the idea that, if these things that you had thought were bad actually do happen, now you're already prepared because you've already thought through how you should be acting step by step instead of being thrown into the middle of the arena without preparation.
Yeah, having thought, it's going to be perfect. Yeah, you can, I had a client a long time ago who was a very high performer, and he was struggling with anger issues. I do a lot of work with that, and he wasn't having the usual kind of anger issues where people lose control and they say something they shouldn't say. Instead, it was just that he was in a very competitive environment, and people would try to push his buttons, and he found himself not, and this makes perfect sense, not able to think through complex solutions adequately and to articulate them at the level that he wanted. He was like a C-suite executive. So he had very high expectations of himself. And so I suggested to him negative visualization. I said, listen, every time you're going to go into one of these meetings, take 3 minutes beforehand in your office and just, visualize these people deliberately trying to get you riled. And how you can respond to it, how you can not respond to it, and he did that, and it helped him out quite a bit.
Because sometimes your response is worse than the original thing in the first place.
Actually, that's so. This is kind of an interesting thing to get close to go out on. One of the things we could actually talk about for future shows is when responses that are trying to fix something actually make it much, much worse, right?
Yeah.
And why that's the case, and how to recover so it doesn't go from one calamity, a small calamity, to a larger calamity, to eventually the whole building falls down.
Gotta, save your losses or cut your losses. There we go.
Yeah.
Oh, hey.
But is there more that we should say about negative visualization, about how people could do it? I mean, I think one thing we could say is, it's a practice that you can do, like we said, before you go into a situation that you think you're going to be challenged, like driving in the morning or, meeting with coworkers. But it's also something the Stoics thought you had to do daily, right?
Right.
Why?
So, there's certain life events that will happen to all of us eventually. We will all, lose a job. We'll all lose a pet. We'll all lose a loved one. None of us are, immortal here. And so at some point in time, we are going to be presented with these hardships of our life, and we should be prepared to actually deal with them in a not incredibly emotionally charged way before we actually have to interact with the experience in the first place.
Yeah, so we're not just reacting on the basis of what we've got, right in front of us. We can behave rationally, you could say. And not rationally in the sense of not having emotions, but, still keeping things in proper perspective. And you're right. Everybody that we know, so this is kind of a downer to go out on, but everybody that we know, either we're going to die before them, or they're going to die before us, or we're going to die at the same time. So you got to be, willing and able to deal with that sort of thing. And there's all sorts of other things where negative visualization, it doesn't have to necessarily be visualizing death every day, but the good thing is we're here right now. Yeah.
So that's what's important at the moment. So, we're going to be wrapping up here. I'm Dan Hayes once again, and
Greg Sadler.
And we have lovely outro music by our friend
Scott Terulli.
There we go. Thank you very much for this inaugural episode of Wisdom for Life from Riverwest Radio.